Thank you very much for the organizers for having me. I think I probably speak for a lot of us when I say that this is probably the highlight of the year to come to this conference. So I'm very excited for the next iteration in Amsterdam. So this paper, Disinflationary Policies with Imperfect Credibility, with a co-author of mine at UNSW Australia, which, as I was just telling Bruce, it's required. The university tells me I have to put Australia in there just in case you don't know where it is. So motivation. So I was thinking about, I really actually should title this slide Rationalization, because when I started this project with Mariano, Mariano works on modeling anticipation and monetary policy announcements under rational expectations in DSG models. I, of course, work on learning, and so we got together and we were thinking we should do something together. We should think about how can we think about anticipation and anticipated structural change, but add some sort of learning framework into it. So we really thought about how we wanted to think about expectations and think about that before we actually thought of what we should do with it. So in this first iteration, we're going to give you a disinflation paper. Why disinflations? Well, Mariano's Argentinian, and that's all they can think about. Hopefully I'll say some motivating facts which are hopefully uncontroversial, but if they are controversial, maybe it'll make the talk more interesting. So there are benefits to low and stable inflation. I think that one's probably not controversial. This one may be a little bit more, but I'll show you some data. On average, there are costs associated with lowering inflation. The costs associated with lowering inflation are inversely related to policymaker credibility. So the more credible you are, the lower the costs are. And the final one is that rising inflation can be associated with losses in policymaker credibility. And this last one actually, I think, is the motivating point that actually makes this paper relevant, even in this current situation where we're sitting now, where we're really thinking about reinflation in most of the world. You might be thinking, why do we care about disinflations right now? I mean, most people are having trouble with low inflation. Well, if you actually think about central banks, and the choices they have to make, right? I mean, they're weighing costs and benefits, and as Mordecai pointed out on Thursday, there probably were benefits, perhaps substantial benefits, to running above target inflation over the last 4 or 5 years. Not saying that the central bank didn't try, but there could have been benefits to trying to get that policy off the ground. And if you're thinking about benefits to that, then you also have to worry about costs. And costs that can be associated with it is that rising inflation can be associated with losses in policies. If you're above your target, maybe expectations become unanchored, and then it may become costly to bring those expectations down. So even though this is not the current policy situation we face now, anytime you're thinking about the costs and benefits to above or below target inflation, these sort of issues crop up, and so therefore knowing or having an idea about how imperfect credibility and how policy works in this case is interesting. So the cost of disinflation. So this is macro 101. So we're going to think about the sacrifice ratio, the cumulative output loss by lowering annual inflation by 1 percentage point. And as I alluded to in the first slide, I'm going to show you just a little bit of data on the sacrifice ratio and what it looks like in a cross-country data set. And so what we did is we looked at a paper by Lawrence Ball in 1994 who lays out a methodology, a simple methodology for calculating sacrifice ratios in actual data. And this methodology has been replicated in dozens upon dozens of papers since then. And the basic idea is you take a moving average of inflation, and he does a 9-quarter moving average that's two-sided. So you take a quarter, you do 4 quarters previously, 4 quarters after, and you say, all right, anytime that moving average falls by 2%, I'm going to call that a disinflation episode. And then how do you calculate the costs? Well, you just take log GDP for that country, and you say, all right, well, where inflation peaked, I'm going to take that point in log GDP, and I'm going to find where inflation troughed. I'm going to move ahead 4 quarters, and I'm going to find the point of log GDP, and then I'm going to draw a line between the 2 points. And then I'm going to subtract the actual path of log GDP from that line, and that's going to give me my measure of output losses. So at first things like, oh, okay, that seems rather ad hoc, but it actually turns out to work surprisingly well. And surprisingly well, I mean, when I go to an estimated DSG model and I use the actual output gap measure that's in the model, and I compare it to what would happen if I just did this, you get comparable numbers. So it's actually a surprisingly good method, and it's easy to employ. You know, in an afternoon, you can pull down a data set from the OECD and calculate sacrifice ratios. And that's what I did. So I've identified 171 disinflation episodes from 42 countries from 1960 to 2014. And just looking at the empirical distribution, here I get the thing I said before. There is mean and it has a positive cost, so 2.75, which is relatively large. However, the distribution is huge. So standard deviation of 8.5, and if you look at like the 10th through the 90th percentile, ranges from benefit ratios of negative 3.2s. These were, you know, disinflation episodes that caused booms, to sacrifice ratios up to 11.2. And so you might be saying, okay, that's great. What's the usefulness of this distribution to policymakers? That's a good question. For the most part, this distribution is actually not that informative because this distribution, of course, is unconditional. So I haven't said anything about whether or not any of these disinflations are unintended or whether these were intended or unintended disinflations. I know nothing about the credibility of the central banks that were, you know, the regimes that were in place when these were happening, or, you know, even the type of policies that were being implemented. So I have this positive mean. That positive mean is out there. It's pretty large, but it's not clear that that number is actually relevant to, say, the Federal Reserve if they're trying to think about the cost and benefits of having 6 or 7% inflation for a couple of years, and then what would happen if they had to bring it down. This paper is going to try to focus on thinking about, okay, well, it's, you know, what is it going to look like with intended disinflations? So just to show you what the distribution actually got us and sort of give you an idea what the shape of this thing looks like, and this is it. So 40 to negative 40, lots of clumps around 0, but quite wide. So as I say, you know, I'm not taking this super seriously. So what if we wanted to do some conditional distribution? So we just want to run some regressions and just try to take out some observable characteristics. You know, what would you find if you did this? And it turns out that there is a large literature that has done this, and you don't find a whole lot. So a recent survey by Katayama and co-authors note that the literature provides mostly mixed evidence, and there's significant sensitivity to modeling the specifications. So, you know, you change around what controls or, you know, how you specify these regressions, and the results all change. To sort of verify these things, I sort of just played around with this as well and just threw some things in. The first column there just has some observable characteristics, the change of inflation, initial inflation, duration, and, you know, you get, you know, large standard errors, and so the only thing there that has stars next to it would be the size of the disinflation, so it looks like large disinflations are less costly. What I actually want you to focus on in this table is the second two columns here, where I want to think about intended disinflation. So the literature normally just looks at, you know, what are the sort of the policy environments in individual countries, but still doesn't really answer this question about, you know, did the country actually, the central bank actually set out on a policy and intend to actually disinflate? So I wanted to condition on intentional disinflations and maybe try to get an idea of credibility. And so to do that, I went and used this data set that is constructed by Dreyer and co-authors at EHT Zurich. I may have messed up a letter there. A number of letters in Zurich. And they have a couple of papers where they've assembled a data set of central bank governors going back to 1975. And what they have in this data set is they can tell you when a new central bank governor was appointed, whether that appointment was because of an end of term, or whether or not it was an irregular appointment, so, you know, they kicked out the old person, whether it was a reappointment of the same person, and then, you know, you can also, they give you numbers on the duration. So you basically can just see the history of central bank appointments. So I did this, just a dummy variable for new central bank governor. And so I say in the year before or the year of the start of a disinflation program, if you have a new central bank governor appointed, then that maybe is a signal of an intended disinflation. You change policy, maybe it was intended. You got a new person in there, and maybe that's also a signal of credibility. You want to say, I'm not happy with the regime for whatever reason, I'm putting a new person in charge. And what happens, again, you get a coefficient that has what you think is maybe the right direction, but if you notice you throw it in with other stuff, the coefficient actually flips signs, so it's not clear what's coming out of there. So there's not a strong correlation with that. I also have this variable that says reappointment, and so this takes a 1 if the central bank governor was reappointed during a disinflation, maybe saying that the policy was, what the other policymakers who had the decision to reappoint that person, it was a policy they liked. And again, you don't get a coefficient or you don't find a correlation in there that sort of fits with what people think about credibility. The last one, which has a large negative coefficient here, or negative correlation, which makes sense, and what you'd like to see is I have this irregular appointment one where I just separate out and say, okay, what if you were appointed the year before disinflation happened or the year of, and it was an irregular appointment. So this means that the person you are replacing didn't fulfill their entire term. So for instance, the Volcker recession gets a 1, with that dummy variable be turned on for that. And here you do see again, this looks like it lowers the sacrifice ratio when it's, it looks like there's some sort of credibility and a credible change in policy as you're kicking out the old person who's not doing their job, you're putting in somebody new. But again, it's not like this is separating out this distribution and telling you that this is, there's a lot of variance around it.
Yes. Sorry, just clarifying. How many countries are we talking about?
So I have 42.
So this includes also emerging economies?
Some emerging economies. So I use quarterly inflation data. So essentially, if I could find a country that had quarterly inflation data, then they're in there. So that does mean that in some of the countries, so if you look in the paper there, I have a table that gives you all the disinflation episodes. So some of the emerging countries that had quarterly inflation data didn't also have quarterly GDP data. So some of those numbers have an asterisk next to them. But for the most part, it's any country I could find quarterly inflation data, I just threw in there. But again, this is just motivation, so I probably spent too much time on it. But I just think what I'm trying to set up here is what we do, and basically we're going to study the conditional distribution with the emphasis on the distribution of sacrifice ratios implied by new Keynesian models with variable credibility. And the reason we're going to focus on the distribution is because the current literature, and say just, I say current, I say it's really just a series of papers by Guido Ascari and co-authors, have been trying to think about, all right, well, the new Keynesian model and inflation targeting, this is the regime that the majority of central banks around the world sort of think about or have adopted as their policy with inflation targeting. So what do these models under perfect credibility and perfect foresight rational expectations, what do they imply about sacrifice ratios? And this literature says, okay, so take the like the Smets-Bowders model or the Charles Eichhorn-Evans model, a medium scale DSG model with all those frictions in there, and let's look at disinflation policies, perfect credibility, perfect rationality, and they find you can hit the mean of that unconditional distribution. So perfect credibility, perfect rationality, you hit that 2.75 number that I showed you earlier. So the unconditional distribution. So even in these models, you get large sacrifice ratios. So if you're a central banker, that's scary. That's a reason to really want to hold on to your defend your inflation target. And they go through and look at things how credibility, they don't do a lot of formal credibility things. They do a couple of, so there's not a lot done on credibility, but there is a lot done on differential policy and size of policy. And basically all the things that you sort of think about in the literature as being important to the sacrifice ratio, they get predictions for all of these things. And other than being able to uncover the mean, all the rest of those predictions, don't seem to be uncovered in, when you do regressions like I've done before. And so that got my co-author and I thinking that, maybe it is the case that if you turn the shocks back on these papers, so I didn't say this, but it's written up there, that they do all this, of course, in a non-stochastic setting. So you take a DSG model and take out the S and just turn off all the shocks and let it run and look at what the paths look like. Maybe the shocks are actually playing a large role and you're getting huge spreads of the sacrifice ratio, and the variance of these things are so large that you just shouldn't expect to be able to pick anything up in the data. And maybe it's the distribution of sacrifice ratios matters. And so if the distribution matters, then that actually implies something interesting for learning, because that says that shocks are going to matter. And if you have perpetual learning or constant gain learning, the shocks and that learning mechanism are going to have some possibly some interesting interactions that could be useful for policy. So what we're going to propose is a flexible and parsimonious way to model credibility by mixing sort of a rational expectation solution, which hopefully I won't use the word rational after this, and I'll say a forward-looking solution to the model, with an adaptive learning solution. And the basic idea behind it is going to be that expectations are going to have an anchored component that is going to be based off of sort of the rational solution. It's going to be forward-looking, and then there's going to be an adaptive component that's going to be based off of the actual evolution of data. And that adaptive component is going to serve as our measure of credibility. Mainly, the degree to which agents' expectations are formed by looking at data rather than the forward-looking solution is going to be credible. It's going to be credibility. So if the central bank has no credibility, then agents just look at data. That's what they believe. The evolution of inflation, that's what matters for their choices. If the central bank has full credibility, then they do the full rational solution. If the central bank wants to announce a different inflation target, they implement the rational beliefs and make decisions in accordance with full rational expectations. If they have degrees of credibility, we're going to do something in between. And we like this mainly because we think this is at least similar to how some policymakers view how the world works. And so we throw up this quote by a former, I think former vice chairman of the federal, he's not there anymore, is he? No, that's what I thought, okay. So in standard theoretical model environments, long-run inflation expectations are perfectly anchored. Models, by their nature, only stylized representations of reality, and a policy of achieving temporarily higher inflation over the medium term would run the risk of altering inflation expectations beyond the horizon that is desirable. So essentially, if the data moves away from what the central bank has told people is their targets, people might start to believe that the central bank is incredible and might follow the data where it goes. And he finishes off with, were that to happen, the cost of bringing expectations back to their current anchored state might be quite high. So this sort of gives you the, what we're hoping is the id of the central banker, and this is what they're worried about, and we're providing a model that basically gives you these exact features. Okay, so what do we find? We're going to find that shocks are going to play a large role in determining disinflation outcomes, and this is actually going to happen at all levels of credibility. So even when you look at a New Keynesian model, a small New Keynesian model with shocks, the sacrifice ratio, the variance in that thing is actually going to be quite large for disinflation programs. Imperfect credibility, though, of course, is going to amplify the distribution of sacrifice ratios as you would expect, and it's going to generate right skewness in the distribution, meaning that on average disinflations are going to be more costly, and the tail events are going to be very costly. However, there's still going to be mass over zero and over benefit ratios. So even if you have no credibility, you could still end up with a costless disinflation. Just on average, it's not as likely. So what we're going to find is that the design of disinflation policy, so such as whether you do cold turkey, gradual, you announce the policy before implementing it, these things are actually going to affect the shape of the distribution of sacrifice ratios more than the means. So the mean sacrifice ratio isn't going to move a whole lot, but the distribution is going to change in ways that central bankers might care about. So if you think shocks matter, this might be perhaps provide a more informative answer to the question than what you get in just the perfect credibility, perfect foresight work that has been done recently. And finally, we find that pre-announcement and opportunism are going to be important policies when you have imperfect credibility. And so what do I mean by opportunism? I mean, if it happens by chance that shocks lower your inflation rate for some period of time, that's a good time to announce a disinflation policy. And in fact, we'll show that it can be such a good time that opportunism can actually trump credibility, meaning that you can actually have a lower mean, a lower variance of the distribution, lower skewness of the distribution by announcing after a period of lower inflation to have a disinflation, even with imperfect credibility, than if you had full credibility in a perfect rational expectations world. And I think this result is actually really, really nice because there are a lot of central banks out there that I think have practiced opportunism. So in the example, I gave this paper at the Reserve Bank of Australia just last month, and many people there said that in the early 1990s, Australia, just by chance, had their inflation rate drop from 4% to 2%. When it hit 2%, they said, hey, guess what? We're inflation targeters now, and our target's 2%. So it was an accident, but they took it. And there's a discussion that this happened in the US as well in the early 1990s. Inflation went from something like 3.5%, 4% in the early 90s and dropped down to 2%, and it was by accident. The Fed kept it there. Okay, what is my time looking like?
You're doing great.
Doing great. Okay, well then I'm going to split that slide. There's lots of important components, related literature. In fact, I had a feeling walking in here today that there are certain people in the room who have probably written more on this subject than I've read. So there's a large literature. We are standing on the shoulders of many people in this room. So we can talk about that afterwards if I have time. So imperfect credibility by combining expectations. So what are we going to do? And I'm almost embarrassed to throw this up here, as in Mariano and I literally just did the most obvious thing possible when it comes to formulating our expectations. Is he had a method a simple method for thinking about anticipation and announcements and rational expectations models. I had a simple method for thinking about learning, and we just said, why don't we just take a linear combination of how that works? And we coded it up, and it gave us something interesting, and we just decided to stick with it. But I think after seeing some papers today, or papers over the course of the conference, I think they're taking notes on things why this actually is maybe a better thing to do than I originally gave it credit for. So we're just going to take basically the expectations that I say out of a forward-looking model, put a weight on it, and then you're going to have expectations that come out of an adaptive model, and those are going to be the expectations that we're just going to plug into a linear structural model to do most of our to do our work. So what do I mean by that? Well, because this is a learning conference, I'm going to start with the adaptive stuff first, not the forward-looking. So we're just going to consider a linearized structural model, and agents are going to have a perceived law of motion that's going to be consistent with the MSV solution. They're going to do standard learning, just like is done in the Evans-Honkapoya book, and that's going to give you the solution of the model under adaptive learning. And of course, we're going to consider a constant gain. Now, for the forward-looking component, again, thinking about the same structural model, and how we're sort of thinking about this is a forecast combination sort of setup. So you can imagine that agents, they run these bars based on their perceived law of motion, but they also can think about that bar as having a structural interpretation. And on the structural interpretation, they can use it, just as we use a DSG model, to think about how they should incorporate news or anticipation or anticipated structural change, anything like that, how they should incorporate that, how their beliefs should evolve. What do those forecasts look like out of that structural model? And so we think of them just having the rational expectation solution, which is maybe not that bad of an assumption, since we know that learning converges to the rational solution. So if you think that before the disinflation policy happens, learning has already converged, they already have coefficient estimates that are close to what the rational solution would have been. And so they, of course, look at the rational solution, and they can pull out a forecast out of that, and that's what they're going to use for their forward-looking part. Now, to think about announcements in this framework, we're just going to use a simple method that actually is going to just leverage the T-mapping. So what I mean by that is announcements about, at time TA, about some forthcoming change at T star are going to be solved using a backward recursion using the T-map. So in particular, you set up a T-mapping like this that basically just has relates QT to some QT plus 1, so whatever that structural matrix is. And you basically calculate what the final structure is. So they say the inflation target is going to change in 2 quarters. You back out what that means for the structural matrices in 2 quarters, and then you run it through quarter by quarter to back out how your expectations should evolve. And that gives you a sequence of QTs. Once you have the sequence of QTs, you can back out the sequences of CTs and GTs that would be implied by that. And then you can bring them all together. Yes?
Can you go back to the previous slide?
Sure.
I'm sorry, I didn't follow. So what what is happening here? So there is a change at T star. So there is some parameter which is going to change at T star. Is that the way?
Yeah, so at T star, there's some parameter change, and you know about it at TA. And so if you want to figure out how expectations should evolve,
But under rational expectations.
under rational expectations, yeah. So you can just take that belief and you can run it back through what in the learning we would call the T-map. You can think about this as doing sort of an undetermined coefficients method. If you were thinking about solving the rational solution period by period for what the expectation should be. And so you can just do a backward recursion and just figure out what the path of that has to be.
This is perfect foresight.
This is perfect foresight.
The assumption here is that there is an announcement out of the blue once and for all.
Yeah, once and for all. So this is once and for all unanticipated structural change.
So this is pretty standard.
Yeah, no, exactly. I'm not saying this is nothing new.
No, but the innovation is to use capital T both for time and for the operator.
Yeah, that's a great innovation.
Yeah,
Sorry.
point taken. Yeah. So So do you have a question?
Well, I was just gonna say, I guess when you mix the expectations, the idea is that, so the rational expectation doesn't take account of the learning values,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And so the idea is people kind of have both of these on the table, and there's some people who read the textbooks and they say, you know, I think this is what's going to happen, and maybe this corresponds to the central bank's announcements or something, that they announce a path. And then there are other people who don't trust it, and they're just adaptive learners. But the adaptive learners do respond to the data that's generated by the mixed expectations.
That's correct. That's correct. So yeah, so I like to think about it in a forecast combination context, in that, you know, as a forecaster, I can use structural models. I can use just database models. I don't know which is correct or which to use. So when I get information, I can trust my structural model, or I can just trust the data. I get forecasts out of both of them, I combine them, and that's what my expectations are based off. So that's why I call it the forward-looking component, because it's not rational when, you know, lambda is not equal to 1, when you have mixing between rational and the learning solutions, and the rational expectations are wrong.
But what about if the other type has just naive expectations, for example? The rational guy has the lagged variables in their T-map. So in that case, so if the backward looking is rather simple and is included in the specification of the rational model, then it is fully rational.
Yeah, so that I guess that would be true. You could.
But
So
it's
for
not-
example-
but it's not included.
It's not included.
They look up in the textbooks and they just put you have a weight of lambda on what the textbook says, and you have 1 minus lambda on most recent data, because it's naive forecasting.
Yeah, but
Well-
if you do rational against naive here, wouldn't the rational be fully rational?
If you did rational against naive, so I guess the thing is, I still think this lambda would have to show up somewhere in the structural matrices. So even if it was just lambda, or sorry, if it was just naive, so there wasn't any learning recursion going on, you just had one fraction being naive, if I'm understanding your equation right, and then one fraction being rational. If they calculate the rational solution the way I'm having them calculate the rational solution, they wouldn't take into account the fact that there was this proportion of people who are naive, and I think that would then make their expectations wrong relative to what's going on. So they could take into account, they would have to, their solution would depend on the fact that there were naive agents in the economy, correct? I mean, so that's your work in the 97 paper in econometrics, right? The rational agent has to take into account the proportion of agents that are naive, and they have to use that to calculate the actual rational path. So they could do that, but the way I'm calculating the solution here, they don't consider the fact that there are any naive agents. Mainly because I don't like to interpret this as a heterogeneous agent story. I'd like to interpret this as a representative agent that has two models. They have an adaptive model, and then they have a structural model, and they're combining the two. Yeah.
Just a super quick question. What about the information set over the shot?
the agent observes all shocks?
Yeah. So
It's just.
no. So this is true. Yeah. So in the learning, so yes, we do have the agents observing the shocks, and so in some sense, if we so it is contemporaneous timing. But for their learning, they're using the last observation. They're not using the contemporaneous observation in the learning, but in the rational solution portion, it's contemporaneous timing.
But in principle, within one period, the agents could figure out whether the central bank is following the announced path.
Yeah, I guess, technically the way we're calculating the solution. So that's why we're trying to say that, so although we're using the rational techniques to back out what the solution is, we want to think about it as a boundedly rational technique, is that they just have an idea of what the structural model is, they have an idea of what the parameterization is, and then they calculate out a path, but they're not smart enough to figure out all the pieces at once. Okay, so a few comments. So clearly rational expectations and adaptive learning solutions are special cases in this. If you take that lambda variable that governs the weights all the way to 1, you recover the rational solution. If you take it all the way to 0, you're just in the adaptive learning framework. Anchoring expectations in this way is going to impart stability to the adaptive learning process. Basically putting a weight on that, the rational solution is basically going to put a down weight on the expectations that are coming from data, and this is actually going to make it so that if you're doing stuff like Bill was thinking about the other day about perpetual learning, the system won't blow up as much, so you get these stability gains, and you can work this out pretty simply in just a simple explanation. Convince yourself that lambda will make the system more stable. So basically, any equilibrium that is E-stable under regular adaptive learning will be E-stable when you're doing this mixing, and equilibria that are not E-stable can actually be made stable by putting enough weight on rational expectations. So in the absence of structural change, this kind of goes with the second process. In the absence of structural change in anticipation, there's a degree of observational equivalence as lambda and gamma, the gain parameters, serve sort of similar roles. And the last thing, which is the most controversial thing on the slide, is that we're going to take lambda as given for our exercises. Now, I clearly believe that lambda should be time varying. So I have papers about thinking about forecast combination and making the lambda time varying. But we thought about for this exercise, from putting ourselves in central bankers' perspective, there's sort of this idea that when you come into a disinflation episode or when you come into any policy change, you have a certain credibility that you're endowed with. And as the Federal Reserve likes to think, they have credibility that was hard won through the Volcker disinflation. And if you want to gain more credibility, what do? You have to successfully execute a policy. So from that point of view, it seems like you come in with an amount of credibility, and if you succeed in your policy, you may gain additional credibility, but our place of interest is in between those 2 points. So because of that, we're just going to leave lambda fixed over the disinflation episode. It may be the case that maybe you're incrementally gaining credibility as you get closer to the target. That could be the place. I think that's something interesting to study. But we just sort of felt when we started playing around with how to endogenize this, that any endogeneity we did could be just as controversial as leaving it fixed. So we're just going to take lambdas fixed. A central banker has their credibility given to them at the start of a disinflation episode. They implement the disinflation. Once they've achieved it, they may get better. They may obtain more credibility, but that's out of where we're studying. So we're just going to leave it for the future.
Define credibility.
So credibility in this context is how much do agents put weight on the data versus their structural forward-looking solution. So if they don't believe, so in this context, right, the central bank is going to be changing an inflation target or they could be changing a rule. And if they have zero credibility, the agents are going to be full adaptive learners, and they're going to have to learn about that change over time and how the data evolves. If they're fully credible, then they know.
Sorry, but just to clarify, but is then just lambda your credibility?
Yes.
Okay, so credibility is a parameter.
So credibility is a parameter. That's correct. Okay. So just to show you how imperfect credibility and a disinflation program would work, I'll just take the simplest New Keynesian model I can think of. So most parameters are just set to 1, and just quickly work through a small example for you. So the equilibrium of this model is just a constant. The output gap is, or sorry, the steady state of this model is just a constant, where you have the output gap's at 0. The inflation is at pi bar. The perceived law of motion would then just be a constant, and you would get a T-map that looks like that. So if you want to consider an anticipated change in the steady state inflation from some pi h, some high level inflation, to some low level inflation, announced at TA but implemented at time t+1, what would that look like? Well, there would be 2 stages under imperfect credibility. The first stage would be an initial impact caused by the forward-looking component of expectations, as long as lambda wasn't equal to 0. So if you're fully adaptive, of course, the announcement would have no effect. And then second, there would be a convergence to the new policy regime after adaptive learning. So basically, this mixing allows you to have an anticipated effect to have an effect, and then after that effect has worn off, then it's adaptive learning that's going to take you the rest of the way. So in the simple model, at time t is equal to TA, agents have know that pi h will change next period to pi l, so you have this transition to this new steady state. The forward-looking component can just be backed out from the T-map, so essentially AT+1 has to be equal to AT, so AT star is equal to this ATA. And mixing beliefs, if the adaptive component, assuming the beliefs were at steady state before, then you just have the adaptive component as being AH, so lambda times this, times A bar TA, plus 1 minus lambda AH is the expectations agents will have in time TA. Then moving to what this implies for inflation and output, in a simple model you get very nice expressions. So the output gap, alpha is the feedback parameter on inflation in the simple little Taylor type rule I had. So if that's larger than 1, basically this is going to cause a boom in output. So this is sort of a known result going back to Ball 1994, again actually a different paper, an AAR paper, where he says in sticky price models, announcements about disinflationary policies actually cause booms. And so that's what you see here. And of course that boom is then scaled by lambda. So as lambda goes to 0, where you're in the fully adaptive learning case, thank you, nothing happens. And inflation, the same thing. So inflation will fall by some amount given the announcement, but again scaled by how credible the announcement was. So that's why we think this lambda is really nice to think about credibility, because you get the effects of the announcement, but it's scaled by how much people believed you. So basically this is what it looks like under rational expectations. Here's what it looks like under our mechanism. So you have an initial announcement, and then afterwards you have to converge. And so notice there's a couple of stylized facts that people sort of think about. Disinflation programs, under rational expectations, interest rates only fall. In fact, they overshoot in this simple model and then drop, and there's a boom and then no constant output. Under this hybrid method, you have an initial impact, but because inflation didn't fall far enough in the next period, the central bank has to raise interest rates, leading to a persistent open output gap and costs associated with the disinflation program. I think I don't have enough time to explain that, so I'll just go right to a quick quantitative exercise where we'll just look at what the distributions of these things look like. So we took the New Keynesian model of Ireland 2004. Why we use this model is Ireland looks at Rodenberg pricing, which turns out to be important when you think about non-zero inflation steady states. So under Calvo pricing, the non-zero inflation steady state is how the linearization of the model, of which I think every time I've seen it in this conference so far, if you weren't linearizing around the zero inflation steady state when you wrote the normal equations you're used to looking at, you were either did something wrong or you were actually implicitly assuming Calvo. So there's a recent paper in the JDL by Ascari and Sorbonne, I believe, who talk about this, that under Calvo pricing, they're actually, the linearization looks different when you think about non-zero inflation steady states, and it actually implies all sorts of different things about learning and different things about policy. So if you do Rodenberg pricing, all that goes away, and it doesn't matter what you do. So I'll show one last figure since I'm out of time. So how does credibility affect this distribution? So this is on a model that I use Bayesian methods to estimate the model on US data, and I assume, so US post-Volcker data actually, so I want small shocks. So I'm going to just think about a small shock environment. So what would happen if suddenly, and this is unrealistic because you'd think if inflation jumped to 12%, shocks probably would go up. Well, let's just assume that we had the same shock processes we had now. We also had inflation at 12%, and the Fed was to drop it down to 10. What would be the distribution of sacrifice ratios that a fully rational expectations model would predict? And it would predict something like this, and you can't see that, but the sacrifice ratio is 0.3, so very small, but you'd actually get a fairly large distribution from 2 to -1. As you add some imperfect credibility to this, what do? You get some right skewness, and notice the skewness goes out quite a bit, so now you're going out here all the way to sacrifice ratios of 8, but the mean doesn't move a whole lot. So adding imperfect credibility to these models skews it out, but it has larger effects to the distributions than it does to just the first moment. And as you can see, with imperfect credibility, you still remain with possibly to get 0 sacrifice ratios. And the last one I'll show is just you go all the way to adaptive learning in this model. What happens? Well, now you get sacrifice ratios out to 40, which actually are not unheard of given the literature, given what I showed you at the beginning with the actual data. But again, you still have things at 0. And so I'm out of time, so we won't look at any of these. I'll just go right to my conclusion slide, which we propose a parsimonious way to model imperfect credibility. The model captures the idea that expectations are imperfectly anchored and depend on the path of data. I didn't get to show you those results, but you can look at the paper that announcements and opportunity play an important role in lowering the mean variance and skewness distribution of conditional sacrifice ratios. Thank you very much.